What we're talking about here is nothing less than re-baselining the way we identify, mature, and develop concepts that will shape the service for years to come. This is critical because there's so many things that we need to get right. So how do we take in new ideas? How do we test them? How do we align them with the art of the possible? Then resource them according to the science of the practical.
From the Defense and Aerospace Report, this is The Downlink, a podcast about the intersection of space, the space business, and defense. Not just what's over the horizon, but what's happening above it. I'm your host, Laura Winter. Just now, starting this episode, is a soundbite from the U.S. Space Force Chief of Space Operations, General Chan Saltzman. He was opening the second day of the Air and Space Force Association's annual Air Space Cyber Convention. This gathering for current and former members of the Air Force and the Space Force is probably the most important one on the calendar. Everyone who cares about these branches of the military pays close attention because it is here over the course of 3 days that major announcements are made. And I have to admit to you that I have not always attended. And that's because in years past, it was so air power oriented. Anything to do with space was overly orchestrated and restrained. Not great for this podcast, but this time it was different. And for me, it started with the very first event on the second day. It started with the CSO telling the audience the Space Force is taking over key parts of Space Force development. That's military speak for people. This episode is about the changes to recruiting and developing Space Force Guardians, the officers, the enlisted, and civilians, because as the CSO said it, what we were is not what we must become.
When it was once only necessary to access and use the domain for national benefit, now an essential job of the Space Force is to control the domain. And that means achieving space superiority, so that we can continue to access and exploit the domain, also denying our adversaries the use of space capabilities against us. The Space Force secures our nation's interests in, from, and to space. That's our mission. And now that mission must be accomplished in an era of great power competition, which means we face new requirements, new expectations, new threats. We're required to field new organizations, new training, new equipment, new operational concepts. What we were is not what we must become.
And later in his speech, he said this.
We expect officers to be our leaders and planners with breadth and understanding in all disciplines of space power. We expect our enlisted to be our primary warfighters, weapons system experts with deep technical knowledge. And we expect civilians to support every aspect of the service, providing stability, vital specialization and expertise, and the corporate knowledge to ensure continuity of operations. With this as our foundation, we're redesigning the career paths of all Guardians, laying the groundwork for the development opportunities to match. For example, for the officers, we have implemented a new initial skills training, an officers training course that every new lieutenant will attend. Over the course of 12 months, these new officers will receive education across the full spectrum of Space Force operations. This includes satellite operations, intelligence operations, and cyber warfare operations, as well as exposure to force modernization, joint planning processes. And when they graduate this training course, our new officers will serve in the operational force, building the understanding that will serve them well as they move forward in their career as Space Force leaders. OTC is just one small piece of the process, but it's a critical step towards developing multidisciplinary officer corps that we need. This is not just a good idea anymore. We've started it. 2 weeks ago, STARCOM welcomed the first class of OTC students, and they're already off and running. This effort will not be limited to officers, of course. We're already turning our attention to how to train, develop our enlisted and civilian Guardians. Starcom is working to stand...
The CSO delivered that to a full house of thousands, standing room only. The crowd actually flowed out of multiple doors and onto the convention center's concourse. And what's even more, most of those who came to listen were Air Force officers and enlisted. In his speech, he hit upon many subjects that will take time to discern and could fill the time of many episodes. These I hope to cover in the future. So this week, the focus is on the big picture messages the CSO and the Chief Master Sergeant delivered on developing the force and space-minded culture. Before now, the Air Force has been tasked with schooling new recruits and even with recruiting them in the first place. Space Force Chief Master Sergeant John Bentavenia had a few announcements about that.
Hey, recruiters. Not only have you exceeded your goal to recruit airmen, but you're also out there recruiting guardians. So today we're leveraging Air Force Recruiting Service, right? Those airmen professionals that are out there that are recruiting airmen, using a system, a process that has been optimized to recruit tens of thousands of airmen across about 150 AFSCs. We're asking them to recruit guardians in 3 functional areas, and this year, they exceeded our goal, about 700 guardians in fiscal year 24. So thanks a lot, recruiters. I appreciate that because I know you hit your goal and you're helping us out as well. So thank you very much. Then you go to BMT. We have a detachment at BMT, but we are leveraging the complete infrastructure that the Air Force has to offer for those guardians' initial experience. And the relationship and the leadership down has been phenomenal, giving us dormitories, allow us to build a safe space for guardians. But in reality today, the guardian experience we're trying to deliver for them is a top-off on top of everything else they're doing because they're still going through today the airman course at BMT. You go to tech school, especially for our cyber and our intel professionals at Goodfellow, at Keesler, they're going to courses primarily taught by airmen, Air Force courses. And General Alvin and Chief Flossie, they're trying to develop air-minded warfighters. So we have to make sure, what are we doing to develop space-minded warfighters and guardians? So I appreciate the relationship. You guys are helping us get out, and the talent and the capability of those guardians coming out of those courses are phenomenal for today. But we have got to work out and design our own training for the future.
And then the Chief Master Sergeant borrowed a line from the CSO.
What we were is not what we must become. What we were is not what we must become. We have to shift the way we think about this. Scouting, as I like to call it. We need to scout for talent. It's a different philosophy. And it's a service responsibility. As much as I appreciate and love the airmen who are recruiting for us today, scouting talent and building the Space Force is a service responsibility, and we're getting after it. We just recently, I think, selected a commander for the first, I call it scouting squadron, that we're going to have an Air Force recruiting service down there. And then we identified, I think, 11 guardians who are going to be guardian talent scouts, is a phrase I like to use. And they're going to go down, they're going to get trained, they're going to learn how the Air Force recruits. They're going to learn how the Marine Corps recruits. They're going to learn how other agencies are going to go out to industry and academia. And they're going to learn what are the best practices to scout, attract, develop talent.
Yes. To all of you out in the audience that are concerned about space defense capability requirements and efforts to acquire them, Space Force leadership did discuss those, but in this episode, we are considering what the CSO and Chief Master Sergeant are saying about how they are shaping the future corpus a spiritus, or body and soul, of Semper Supra, because all the cool tools and gadgets in the world are nothing, or even worse, without the right people, with the right training and branch culture. In this case, space-mindedness. And this is something the military, no matter the branch, is keenly aware of. So During a press conference with the CSO, I asked him to further explain where he thinks the Space Force started culturally, where it is now, and where he wants it to go, and to put some context to the term warfighter, which so often is used as an adjective to illustrate Space Force culture, but for an outsider, it's kind of an opaque catch-all. Here's his answer, illustrating what he means.
I'll start. What we were was an organization designed around efficient supply of space effects. That's access to the domain and exploitation of the domain. We provided space lift and all the ground network antennas to provide RF connectivity to our ground forces or to our ground networks. We provided missile warning. We provided PNT. We provided satellite communications. That was our job. And our job then was to do that as efficiently as possible with taxpayer dollars. And the reason we could afford to do that is we were operating in a benign environment. Now, space is a contested environment. That means we have to add to those basic core functions, access and exploit. Now we're adding control. We have to actually be able to fight and contest the domain so that we can continue to exploit it for those things the warfighters have come to expect: SATCOM, missile warning, ISR, PNT. It's not assumed that we will have access to that data unless we can control the domain. So we have to have the equipment, we have to have the training to be able to overcome adversary action to preserve those capabilities. When he says we want to be warfighters, that's what that means. When you see interference on your SATCOM, you assume that an adversary is jamming you. You don't assume you're having an antenna malfunction. That's the difference between a warfighting mindset and being in an old mindset where it was a benign environment.
Now, ever since the Space Force was established in 2019, space power advocates, some of them guests on this podcast, have been loudly critical of Space Force's dependency on the largesse or whim of Mother Air Force. Some have even gone so far as to call for a separate department of the Space Force to manage and advocate for Space Force priorities. While a department may be far off for now, there are certain functions that are considered to be military branch responsibilities. They include areas such as public affairs, security, or military police, education, judge advocates, legislative liaisons, acquisitions. What the CSO and the Chief Master Sergeant are saying is that the Space Force has started assuming responsibility for recruitment and training to ensure the force, the people that have signed up to become guardians, are infused with a space-minded culture from the moment they take the oath to serve. To get a deeper understanding of what these changes mean, I caught up with the Space Force's very first Chief Technology and Innovation Officer, now retired, Major General Kim Crider. Here's our conversation. Hey, Kim. It is so great to see you here in Washington, D.C., and also here at the AFA Conference of Air, Space, and Cyber. Could you take a moment and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here. A little bit about myself.
Yes.
Kim Crider. I'm a founding partner for Elara Nova. We are a space consultancy. We consult with small, medium, and large companies that are trying to advance capabilities for national security space. We work with all of the government agencies that are providing capabilities to space today, mostly the United States Space Force. We also work very closely with the NRO and with U.S. Space Command, a little bit with NASA. We work with the Department of the Air Force, who still has the overarching responsibility to help ensure that there is a strong Space Force budget. And then we work all the way up to the White House when it comes to policy issues affecting space. We also are reaching out internationally and building an international base so that we can help international companies and international countries develop space capabilities and advance their space economies. I'm a retired two-star general. I had the great honor of being on the ground floor when we stood up the Space Force. And at that time, I was the Chief Technology Innovation Officer before I retired in 2021.
You know, yesterday, you and I were both in Potomac A-B, which is the big, massive hall, and it was just rammed. And the CSO gave about a 25-minute talk, and then Chief Master Sergeant, he gave about a 30-minute talk. And I just sort of feel like there's this interesting undercurrent going on where really the culture of the Space Force, developing the culture of the Space Force, isn't just about talking about it, that there seems to be some doing about it. And I wanted to get your take on it because you were there at the beginning of the Space Force. And, Salty said yesterday, we don't want to be who we were for what we need to be for the future. And what does that mean to you? Where are we going?
Mm-hmm. It's a really good and important point to make. The Space Force is almost 5 years old. And in that 5 years, I think, we've laid some foundation. We got the service up and running, and we started down a path to what does it really mean to be a separate independent service, and what does it really mean to be a guardian in this separate independent service, whether you're an officer, an enlisted member, or even a civilian that's assigned to the Space Force. What does it mean to have an identity and to affiliate yourself with that? Culture takes time to emerge, but an important part of a culture of any organization is what you learn about the organization and what it means to be a part of it. So this whole idea of we're going to inculcate individuals into this new service, beginning with training, right, and development, is a really important piece of getting the culture more firmly in place and really starting to break away from the past of prior to ever having a Space Force. The space activities for the United States were provided by the Air Force to, okay, now we've broken away and we have this new service, but it's still new and it's still young and it's still, is in its very formative stages to now 5 years in. We have to really start to inculcate what it means to be this service, what it means to be a member, a guardian of this service. And we have to do that with training and development. But there's 4 components really that General Saltzman talked about in his talk the other day, which is part of really how are we getting this culture more firmly defined and understood. And those 4 things were force design. How do you design for the force that you need? How do you analyze your threat environment and really understand what kind of capabilities you need, what kinds of technologies and concepts you want to experiment with, and how you want to experiment with them in some sort of or assess them in some sort of a wargaming environment, so that you could really begin to put together your plans for the future, force design. And when we say capabilities in the military, by the way, it's capabilities with a big C. So it's not just technology. It's technology plus well-trained people that are organized in a certain way that can then employ those technologies through a certain set of systems and other equipment. So how do you really design for the capabilities that you need in the future? Thinking about people, process, technologies, and all those things coming together. Force design, pulling all that together and having a method that is designed, and as General Saltzman kept saying yesterday, purpose-built for the United States Space Force and what the Space Force needs to provide to the nation. The second piece was force development, getting back to the training, inculcating people with what does it mean to be a guardian? What does it mean to be a Space Force? What do the values of the Space Force really mean, and how are those values presented in the way people behave or the way things get done? And so establishing their own training programs for officers and enlisted members and civilians is a really, really important piece. Up until now, that training has pretty much been an add-on to Air Force training, an initial training within the Air Force. So that's not going to work if you really want to have an identity and you really want to get people thinking about what that means from day one. The third piece, so we had force design, force development, and then force generation. How do you need to really organize the force and ensure that the individuals that are part of these units that are that they are in fact ready to employ those capabilities for maximum effect? And so there's unit level training on their mission systems that they have to be qualified on. There's, the ability to ensure that you've got the right people in the right positions at the right time, so that when you're needing to support certain operations, you've got the right contingent of people, while others are going through continuous advanced training. So what's the right ratio, if you will, of people that are doing continuous advanced training and people that are actually directly supporting the operation? Space Force Guardians are supporting day-to-day operations today. They don't deploy forward. They don't wait for an event to happen. Every single day we are fighting the war in space. So every single day those space units, some amount of them, are being force generated to be ready to be employed by the combatant command, in this case, United States Space Command. And then the fourth piece is, how are those forces presented for employment? So they're well trained, they do their day-to-day mission, they're well organized, they're very proficient on their systems. Now, how, under what construct are they employed and presented to the combatant command? And there's been a whole construct that's been established in the Space Force that is very much consistent with how the Air Force does it, as well as the other services, and this idea of a Space Force component to the combatant command, right? And so the Space Force has gone through this process of establishing these space components to the combatant command, who are responsible for taking those trained, organized, trained, and equipped forces that have been tested through the process of the force generation activities and presented now through these space components to the command. There's space component set up for United States Space Command, Space Forces Space. There's a space component for Indo-PACOM, Space Forces Indo-PAC, and General Saltzman yesterday talked about a Space Forces component for what he called EURAF, right?
Yeah.
European, AFRICOM, right?
Put together, yeah.
Right. So, and the intent is to have these Space Force or these space components established for every combatant command. So, to be a service that is able to deliver capability that can provide effects to the joint warfighting entities of the United States, you have to have in place these processes, right? Force design. What kind of capabilities do you need in the future? Force development. Develop your people towards that. Force generation. Be able to organize and train your individuals in the units to be fully ready and combat credible. And to be able to assess that on a continuous basis. And then force generation, have a mechanism and a process and a structure by which those can actually be presented to the combatant command and assure the ability to be successfully implemented. So that's what makes a service, and that's what fundamentally becomes the scaffolding, if you will, of the culture that we need to define as the Space Force. The fact that we are moving away from just being a service that was once part of the Air Force and now separated without really knowing its identity or having a well-established identity, to something that, from the beginning, individual guardians understand what it means, what it's all about, and these processes are in place to sort of guide the entire organization forward to be able to assure their ability to conduct combat operations today and to evolve to the future and where that force design of the future is taking us.
There was another thing, though, that I think also supports everything that you just said that is new, that came out of Chief Master Sergeant, and that is, he said that they're going to be scouting, that Space Force is going to be scouting, that recruiting isn't going to be solely done by Air Force officers and enlisted. And I found that really interesting. And the thing that he said that also stood out was that it was what was supposed to be done by a branch.
Absolutely. And so, when the Space Force was stood up, there was a very deliberate decision made that the Space Force would be very mission-focused, and it would rely on the Air Force to provide a lot of its support services. Space Force is a very, very small service, 16,000, total Guardians, military and civilian, where the Air Force is, 300 some thousand, so much smaller. So the Space Force needs to rely on the Air Force to provide mission support kinds of services at the installation level, at the base level, if you will. But I think what the Space Force is also realizing is in this evolution towards a more fully established culture for the service, there are certain things that cannot be done by the Air Force, although they do support the ability for the force to come into being. One is this idea of recruiting. Air Force Recruiting Services today currently provides recruiting service support to the Air Force and the Space Force. And as Chief Bettavenia pointed out, we call him Chief B9, they do a great job. They do a really great job of helping to meet the needs of the Space Force. But they're not Guardians. These are not Guardians going out and scouting for and recruiting Guardians. And so what we need is a core within that Air Force recruiting service that is going to go out and scout for the right talent to fill the needs for the service, because the service, through its force design, force development, force generation, force employment processes, will continue to further understand what its needs are and where its gaps are, and thinking about where the threat is going, which influences force design all the way through. What is the threat? Where's the threat heading? And how does that threat inform what the service needs to recruit for in terms of skills and abilities and proclivities? So that's a good word.
That is a good word. And another way to possibly even frame what you're saying is that, the way the Air Force organizes itself, it has career codes, which you used to live under. And I think it's like 150 or something like that. It's 100 plus. And that the Space Force has its own kind of force design, has its own sort of careers that it needs to establish its culture and to establish itself as a branch, and that those requirements to fill those needs within a force structure are going to be different because it's also space-minded.
Well, let's get a few things clear. So the Air Force, yes, has a very large number of specialty codes because it's a much bigger service, and it does a lot of different things in this very large service, some 300,000 service members strong, right? Space Force, much smaller, 16,000 military and civilian members of the Space Force. Is very, very small. So the Space Force, when it was designed around this idea that the Air Force is going to provide all of this mission support sort of capability, and the Space Force is going to focus on real core mission areas. And in doing so, the Space Force is focused on really 4 key areas, 4 key specialties: space operations, cyber operations, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations, and acquisition and engineering is one kind of specialty. So 4 core specialties within the Space Force. And that's what the Space Force needs to recruit for. So when the Air Force Recruiting Service, as an agency of the Air Force, is set up with all the administrative supporting systems to provide recruiting, that's all great and that's all helpful and that's all part of that mission support that it provides to the Space Force. But there needs to be a core within that are fundamentally Space Force Guardians scouting for and recruiting for the talent in those 4 areas. What does it mean to be a space operator? What are the kinds of skill sets that we need to go out and find for space operations? What does it mean to be a cyber operations officer or enlisted member for space? And what kind of skill sets do we want to look for that? What does it mean to be intelligence for space? And what are we scouting for? As well as acquisition engineering for space. So those scouts will be going out to find individuals that perhaps have certain educational backgrounds that align with what we need in those 4 disciplines for space, and have other skills and aptitudes associated with what it means to be able to apply those kinds of functions in a space-based arena. So the beginning of getting to a space-minded guardian is to have individuals that come in with a certain amount of aptitude. So you have to be able to go out and scout for that. Then you bring them in, and now you can begin to develop them towards that true space-minded guardian outcome that you're seeking. And again, both General Saltzman and Chief B9 talked about the need to get to space-minded guardians, not air-minded individuals that transitioned to the Space Force, which is where we've been, right? You had Air Force people that literally transitioned to the Space Force to, no, we want to have space-minded guardians from the beginning and throughout their careers, 100% focused on the mission of the United States Space Force.
Kim, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome, Laura. It's a pleasure.
That's it for this week. For your daily dose of award-winning defense coverage, listen to the Defense and Aerospace Report with Vago Muradian. And for the maritime domain, listen to Cavis Ships with Chris Cavis and Chris Cervello. And get your air domain news and analysis from the Air Power Podcast with JJ Gertler and Vago Muradian. I'm Laura Winter. Thank you for listening.